It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. It's absolutely one of the most legendary opening lines in all of literature, right? But what sounds like just a simple, witty little observation is actually a high-stakes declaration of survival. You see, in the 19th century marriage market, fortune and marriage were literally the absolute center of a woman's existence.
Welcome to This Explainer. I am so thrilled to have you here today. Our goal for this one is simple, but kind of ambitious. We're going to prove that Jane Austen's timeless classic, Pride and Prejudice, isn't just some stuffy, old-fashioned romance. No way. It's actually a razor-sharp critique of human nature, rigid social classes, and the really desperate economics of love.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our game plan. We'll start with Austen and her world, then explore the marriage market, unpack those iconic characters, reveal the real antagonists of the story, and finally, look at its timeless legacy.
Part 1. Austen and Her World, the woman behind the words.
So here we have the brilliant author herself, Jane Austen. She was the seventh child of a parish rector, and while her parents were members of the English gentry, they were actually pretty poor. And the irony here is just incredible. Austen wrote what is arguably the ultimate, defining playbook on courtship, marriage, and securing a wealthy husband. Yet she stayed single her entire life. She absolutely preferred the life of a writer over being a traditional wife and hostess. And because of the restrictive times she lived in, her masterpieces were published completely anonymously until after she passed away.
And you know, there's this really fascinating contrast between the world inside the novel and the world outside of it. Pride and Prejudice was written between 1797 and 1812 and then published in 1813. When you read it, the story feels like this completely tranquil, self-contained little social bubble out in the English countryside. But think about what was actually happening at the time. All of Europe was just embroiled in total war and political chaos. England was fighting for its very survival against the threat of Napoleon, who wouldn't be defeated at Waterloo until 1815. But Austen, she deliberately chose to keep all that imminent threat of a French invasion entirely out of her work.
Because instead of actual war, she wanted to focus on a totally different kind of battlefield. She revolutionized the English novel by pioneering what's called the novel of manners. Back in the 18th century, a lot of novels were focused on these broad, preachy morality lessons. But Austen changed the game. She acted as a bridge to the deep psychological realism we'd see later in the Victorian era. She shifted the focus entirely onto intricate, emotional complexity and the unspoken, very strict rules of human relationships.
Moving right along to Part 2. The marriage market. High stakes in Hertfordshire. The arrival of wealthy bachelors into this world is basically the match that lights the powder keg. Over in the Bennet household, Mrs. Bennet is a rather giddy, frivolous woman, but she is driven by one very real, desperate hysteria. She has got to marry off her 5 daughters. So when the wealthy, down-to-earth Mr. Bingley and his incredibly rich and extremely snobby friend, Mr. Darcy, show up in the neighborhood, the social commotion is just off the charts. The very survival of the Bennet sisters depends completely on securing matches just like these.
Let's quickly track how this all builds across the sprawling plot. Step 1, the inciting ball. Bingley is instantly smitten with the eldest Bennet sister, Jane, while Darcy rudely insults our heroine, Elizabeth. Step 2, cue the illnesses trapping Jane at Bingley's estate and massive misunderstandings fueled by a charming officer named Wickham who lies about Darcy. Step 3, the shocking proposals. A pompous clergyman proposes to Elizabeth and she shuts him down. Later, Darcy himself proposes and she rejects him furiously. Step 4 is the climax. Elizabeth's foolish youngest sister, Lydia, pulls off a scandalous elopement with Wickham, which threatens to ruin the entire family's reputation permanently. And finally, Step 5. Darcy secretly pays off Wickham's massive gambling debts, rescuing the family and finally proving his true, honorable character to Elizabeth.
All right, Part 3. Unpacking the characters, the Bennet family, and beyond. Now, what's really interesting here is how Austen uses the Bennet sisters to represent this whole emotional spectrum. Just look at the contrasts. You've got Jane, the oldest. She's beautiful and sweet-tempered to a fault. She literally refuses to think badly of anyone. Then you have our heroine, Elizabeth, smart, lively, and she places very little value on money compared to personal virtue and independence. And then, way at the far end of the spectrum is Lydia, a vain, empty-headed flirt who never stops to think about the consequences of her actions. Austen is showing us that individual character is molded right there within the family unit.
In The Gentleman, they are just as carefully contrasted. We have Fitzwilliam Darcy squaring off against George Wickham. Darcy has this extreme class consciousness that makes him look completely vain and proud. But dig a little deeper, and beneath that exterior is a guy with immense integrity and generosity. Wickham, on the other hand, is the exact opposite. He seems like the absolute model of a perfect, charming gentleman, but actually, he's a liar, he's a hypocrite, he's an opportunist who cares way more about dodging his gambling debts than he does about ruining a young woman's life.
Which brings us to part 4, the real antagonists, flaws and social class.
You know, Pride and Prejudice doesn't really have a traditional mustache-twirling villain. Instead, both of our romantic leads suffer from distinct sins of the heart and mind that blind them to the truth. Those are the real antagonizing forces of the story. Both Elizabeth and Darcy have these massive blind spots that lead them to make some pretty rash mistakes.
Let's break down this central conflict. On one side, we have pride. Darcy's pride stems directly from his social rank. He looks down on pretty much anyone who isn't in his immediate elite circle. On the other side, we have prejudice. Elizabeth takes so much pride in her own ability to judge others that she forms these hasty, ironclad preconceptions. She stubbornly refuses to revise her opinion of Darcy, even when the evidence is staring her right in the face. To get to their happy ending, these two lovers actually have to help each other see their respective blind spots. Darcy has to shed his snobbery, and Elizabeth has to learn not to trust her snap judgments quite so much.
So the absolutely crucial point here is that these character flaws are operating inside a completely unforgiving system. Women were legally barred from inheriting property. Because they couldn't just go out and build a career, marriage was basically their one and only option for financial security and social survival. That perfectly explains why Elizabeth's friend marries the ridiculous Mr. Collins. It's purely for security, not love. Plus, the rigid class hierarchy dictated everything, literally right down to the massive houses people lived in. A modest home meant limited options, while the palatial elegance of Darcy's estate acted as an outward symbol of his upstanding character. The environment itself forced all the drama.
And finally, Part 5, A Timeless Legacy, Why We Still Care.
So, why do we still care so much about a 19th century novel about the English gentry? Well, get this. Jane Austen's original title for her manuscript wasn't even Pride and Prejudice. It was First Impressions. And that really hits at the core of why this story has such staying power. It's always been about the absolute necessity of looking beneath surface-level appearances to figure out who a person really is. We all struggle with social appearances, right? We all misjudge people. Austen just had the genius to wrap that incredibly universal human flaw up into a brilliant social comedy.
And you can see that enduring pop culture relevance proven by the fact that there are at least 3 massive, major modern screen adaptations of this exact story. Whether we're talking about the 1940 movie, that legendary 1995 miniseries, or the beautiful 2005 film, every single new generation finds themselves identifying with Elizabeth's wit and Darcy's hidden heart.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a bit of a provocative thought. Austen wrote this over 2 centuries ago, but clearly human nature really hasn't changed. How do your own first impressions blind you to the truth today? Who have you dismissed out of prejudice? And where has your own pride kept you from just admitting you were wrong? Think about that for a bit. And if it's been a while, do yourself a huge favor and dive back into Austen's masterpiece. Thanks so much for joining me, and keep learning.